Friends, thank you very much for joining us yet again. James, very nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ian. This Advent.
This Advent. Now, you mentioned Advent. Whereabouts are we in Advent, James?
We are Advent 4.
Oh,
Yeah, fourth Sunday of Advent, which is as late as it possibly can be this year
it is.
because it's the day before the Christmas Day.
Oh,
So
so happy Christmas Eve to you.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
when it comes. So,
when it comes, you probably won't be watching this on Christmas Eve, but
well, yeah,
it could be an early morning.
it could be early morning, last minute sermon preparation, or
Yes, yes,
preparing to listen to sermons, of course.
indeed, indeed.
Uh,
And we're on the passage is Luke 1,
it
26,
is.
38.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to riff a bit on that. We do find it interesting when we look at the numbers of people who watch the video,
Mm.
and what is interesting is after it sort of picks up at certain points, and interestingly, it does pick up. The numbers pick up on Saturday morning, so it's when some people are doing their last bit preparation or for whatever.
Yes.
But we also noticed that the numbers do pick up after Sunday as well. So
Yes, I suppose it could be pastors in Hawaii listening to us, but that seems a little bit unlikely.
no, well, the other thing that's more amusing is people coming back from church and saying, "Well, I wonder
Yes,
what James and Ian thought about
yeah,
that."
quite possibly, in which case forgive
So,
us, please.
yeah. So there we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So our passage is in Luke 1, and of course we're doing this strange thing because we're in year B and we
Yeah.
haven't got enough material. We haven't got enough material in Mark, have
Oh,
we? We
no.
exhausted it 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Uh, so we're doing this strange thing of cycling through the different gospels. So if we had John
Yes.
the fourth gospel last week, we had Mark the week before, and now we're in Luke.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Filling the gaps. Yeah.
filling in the gaps. But talk about filling the gaps. James, tell us to fill in the gaps what it would be great for people watching to do with this video.
Yeah, well, it would be lovely if you liked it. That would be fancy. Do click on the like button or do subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed, because you'll get a notification video. The video. Do share on the social media.
On the social media.
The
Yeah.
social media. And do
I'm going to keep teasing you about that.
yeah, indeed, comment on the blog or
Yes.
on YouTube, on the
Yeah.
social media, wherever you like.
Yeah.
We'll try and respond.
That's
Yeah.
great. Now looking at this passage is really interesting because we find this moving. I commented last week actually on we notice when we move from one gospel to another, having been immersed in a different
Yeah.
one. It's really interesting, isn't it, to notice the sort of changes of tenor and vocabulary and sort of feel from one gospel to another. So last week I commented that we'd moved from the sort of nitty-gritty of Mark to this sort of theological, spiritual, running around the mouth of John.
Yeah.
Now in Luke, we have something rather different in the sense that, I mean, just one of the things I noticed looking through this text again is it seemed to me that his sentence structure is just more careful. His vocabulary is more distinguished. It's kind of writing in a higher register because there's a sense in which in this gospel, in Luke's gospel, he is deliberately he's deliberately doing a number of things, but he's deliberately writing in sort of what would be expected for historiography in his day. He's being a careful historian. He's listened to he's interviewed the eyewitnesses. He's using very nice vocabulary, and he's also doing something with structure as well here. So I don't know if you felt that when you read the passage.
Yeah, I think you do. Inevitably, you do. And I mean, I suppose it's a bit like kind of in our household. Forgive me if people will shoot me down for this, but we like C.S. Lewis and we like J.K. Rowling. But C.S. Lewis is in a higher register. Yes. He can write a sentence, and it's a beautiful sentence. Yes. And J.K. Rowling can tell a story, but C.S. Lewis can tell a story and write a sentence, and that's the sort of distinguishing mark of it. And so, in a funny sort of way, you look for structure in Lewis because he writes well. And I think, as you say, the sort of register of Luke, you do notice parallels, you notice structures, which of course, as we've commented, I think in previous videos, Ian, are very, very common. I mean, Luke does write structurally a lot of the time, and if you notice those structures, it really helps you understand what he's wanting us to know. Yeah.
Well, there's a whole complexity of sort of structures and allusions he's got here, but I just, in the time we've got, I just want to focus on one of them and the most obvious, really. So if I can just share, this is a table from Joel Green's NIC commentary.
Yes.
On Luke's gospel. So I've got the commentary here. I probably should wait after I finish sharing the screen. Again, it's one of those ones which is pretty hefty, so people might be put off by it. But again, even in a hefty commentary, when you're preaching on one passage, you don't have all that much to read each week. And here he's just lists the parallels between the two encounters. So here we've got the encounter of Gabriel with Mary announcing the birth of Jesus. But then, of course, earlier in this chapter, these are long chapters for some reason. Earlier in this chapter, Gabriel has come to Zechariah talking about the birth of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
But fascinating to see both the contrasts and the parallels, isn't it?
It is, and it's of course one of the things we've often mentioned about Luke is this telling of a story about a man and a woman and putting them in parallel with one another. And of course, that's very much the case here. We see Zechariah receiving the angel's message and responding in one way, and we see Mary receiving the angel's message and responding in a slightly different way. And but absolutely, there's parallels, and it's interesting. I think in this this picture you've put up, the language is where we've got exact language. I think the italics mean the word is different.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Which is quite interesting. I mean, it's interesting in terms of the first one.
Yeah.
Luke 1:12, he was troubled. Well, actually, quite a lot of translations say terrified. That's one word. There's a related word in Luke 1:28, which is Mary's response, where it's usually pronounced as perplexed or confused or something like that. It's a slightly different word, and it's a slightly different response. So you've got similarity, but you've also, in the similarity, you've got these slight differences, which also tell you something, I think would be fair to say.
Yeah. And we might come onto it specifically, but the most obvious parallel which is different is where Mary says, "How can this be?"
Yes.
It's actually a statement of inquiry, whereas when Zechariah says, "How can this be?" it's actually a statement of unbelief.
Yes, absolutely. And that contrast in their responses is very, very interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
So that's worth noticing. And in fact, actually, in preparation, if you're looking at this passage, either for yourself or if you're using it for preaching other people, quite a good exercise just to get the passages out and make your own notes about the parallels and so on. And the other thing that Joel Green points out really helpfully is that not only do we have the parallel between the two passages, but we have a parallel between the two passages together and some Old Testament antecedents. So there's in a sense there's parallels with other stories. I mean, I suppose the one that's most obvious is the story of Hannah, who's going to give birth to Samuel, who's longing for a child. But the most striking one is the parallel between these two passages and the story of Abraham and Sarah. And in fact, Joel Green spends 3 whole pages listing the parallels between them. And one of the things that's really striking about them is that the parallels between the Abraham-Sarah story and the parallels with Zechariah and with Mary, interestingly, the parallels are distributed between the two stories in Luke. So it's as if together he's telling the two stories in one, and in the combination, you get all these echoes and allusions to the story of Abraham and Sarah, which is fascinating.
Yes, because both these stories ultimately are about the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, aren't they? And actually, that's one of the things I think Luke wants us to see, that this is a continuous part of the story of God, which God is now intervening to enact in the history of humanity in order to bring about the fulfillment of the promise.
And this is one part that seems to me a rather important element of the way that Luke tells the story, which is that we do, I think we do a couple of unfortunate things with this story. And one of the unfortunate things we do is to say Mary was nobody at all, and she was just some anonymous poor woman, and God came to her. So God comes to anyone who's marginalized. And whatever the merits of that, and there are merits of that because it counteracts a different way we use the story. The thing it misses out on, as you say, is this continuity. And it seems to me that we've discussed this before a long time ago when we talked about the Gospel of Luke. But one of Luke's agendas is to say, look, these are pious, obedient people who are looking to God, who are expectant. So the surprise notwithstanding, at one level, these are not surprising people. And you see that with the parallels of the faith response of Abraham.
Yeah, and Luke is very, very keen on telling us about piety and how being a good, faithful Jew is
observant Jew
is one of the ways in which one of the people in which God is at work and God uses, because they know who He is, they know His ways, and and yet, of course, also there is this that in Luke, he's also concerned for the poor and the marginalized. So you have the both and, don't you? You have the I suppose the kind of the almost not quite the aristocrat, but the the priest in Jerusalem, and you have Mary the Virgin in a provincial town.
Yeah, the last sort of parallel to notice, which I find absolutely fascinating, and I don't think I've got this from Joel Green. I can't remember where I got it from, or why I particularly noticed it. Was we took that sort of parallels within the narrative, and then there's parallels with antecedents to the narrative, but there's also a parallel looking forwards to a later part of Luke's narrative, and that is there's actual language parallel between what Gabriel says to Mary and what Jesus says in Acts 1 to the disciples.
Yes.
You get this parallel language about the power from on high overshadowing it, and then something will happen and something will come to birth. And it's a little bit subtle, but it's definitely there when I looked at the passages together. And it does seem as though Luke is drawing a parallel and saying, as Mary gives birth to Messiah, so the Spirit will come on the apostles, the disciples, and God will bring to birth this messianic community.
Yes.
So when we do say, when we sing Little Town of Bethlehem and we say, "O Holy Child of Bethlehem, descend to us, we pray, cast out our sin and enter in and be born in us today," then that's a legitimate,
pretty much bang on, isn't it? Yeah.
And of course, the most extraordinary verse in the whole New Testament is Galatians 4:19, where Paul says, "I am in the pains of childbirth until Christ be formed in you," which is just a weird way of appropriating this language of birth.
And that idea of the Spirit as the one who creates newness, of course, it's right back there in the Genesis account as well, isn't it? Really, the Spirit brooding over the water. So there is this new life comes when the Spirit overshadows us.
And we get that explicitly in Jesus' teaching in John 3, don't we, about the Spirit bringing a new birth through the Spirit and all. Now, the other thing I thought was really fascinating about these parallels, and we must get on to the teach us the text as well, is that it struck me that the parallel within Luke between the announcement to Zechariah and the announcement to Mary, yet again we get a comparison between John the Baptist and Jesus. And we've had that in the last 2 weeks in completely different ways, haven't we? In the testimony of John and in the citations in Mark.
Yes, and actually what Luke does is he draws out, in the way he puts these in parallel, he draws out the differences between John and Jesus. I mean, they're both born in a sense miraculously, but one by the normal process of conception, one by a miraculous, completely unheard of. Well, it's unprecedented, of course, in Mary, and all those, and the way that Zechariah doesn't believe and Mary does, and all of that. You realize that Jesus is definitely the one to whom everything points, but John has a significant role in doing that pointing, but is a lesser one. He's not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of the sandal.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that in the quite different registers of the different gospels, there's quite different theological priorities, yet they manage to say the same thing.
Yes, isn't that amazing? Yes. It's almost as if they're talking about the same people, isn't it?
It almost is. You're right. But also just fascinating that there's so many different ways you can do this.
Absolutely. What Luke does in parallel narrative, Mark does in succinct. Succinct narrative.
Should we turn to the detail of the text? And just sort of work our way through that so that we've got some, because there are some really fascinating things to note. I was just struck, we talked last week quite a lot about the sentness of the people of God. And again, we have this language of Gabriel being sent from God, which struck me. And this sent to God to a city, a town, village. The word polis there can actually mean a settlement of Galilee named Nazareth. And again, it's all sorts of pregnant possibilities about that, because it does seem as though on the one hand you're in Galilee of the Gentiles, so there's kind of a hint that maybe there's something more going on here than just the redemption of God's people Israel. But again, this theme of piety, where it's quite possible that Nazareth was a sort of center of messianic expectation. It might, because of the way its name might be derived.
Indeed. And it's interesting, isn't it? The these things do work. I think there is this provinciality about the story, which is rather winsome in a way. Yeah, I don't know quite. Yeah,
in terms of it's just ordinariness.
Yes, yeah. I mean, what can anything good come out of Nazareth? Of course, is what Nathaniel says in John, isn't it? And there's obviously something in the public ideas about Nazareth that he could say that and that to be understood. And here we are in Nazareth. Yeah, yeah. And there's this linking, of course, isn't there, as well, between the two stories of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary, because it's in the 6th month, which, of course, is the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, which we need to just perhaps notice that.
Yes. Just worth noting, one of the questions that often comes up, I've got a couple of articles about it separately, about how these stories between Matthew particularly and Luke intermesh. But it is interesting. People say, oh, it's contradictory narratives. But again, a fun exercise is actually work through all the events of both stories, and you find there aren't any actual contradictions. What there are is a difference of emphasis, and then other things which are omitted because each has limited space. But again, you get the shared comment that she was a virgin, she was betrothed to a man, his name was Joseph, and the whole series of other parallels with the Matthew account as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's worth thinking about is who are the sources for these stories, and I think most people would say that Luke's source for the story is Mary, but in Matthew you very much get a Joseph perspective of Joseph, so you would expect them to tell different angles.
Yeah, great little Grove booklet right early on in the biblical series by Richard Borkham. Called "Is the Bible Male?"
Yeah,
and one of the things he points out, which I just hadn't spotted because we converge these stories, is that Luke's account is from the women's perspective.
Yeah.
And Matthew's account is entirely from the male's perspective. In fact, the women don't actually speak in Matthew.
No.
And in Luke's account, the one man who does speak is struck dumb. So
yeah, exactly. It's a wonderful moment that where he points it out.
It is. Yeah. The other thing, just on that provinciality thing, the other thing worth noting is that Joseph and Mary, I mean, they're special names to us, but again, it's worth remembering that they were incredibly common and ordinary names in first century Israel.
Yeah. I gather that half of all the recorded names of women at that time are either Salome or Mary.
That's amazing.
That is actually stunning, isn't it? Yeah.
And therefore, that explains why quite often in the Gospels we see Mary of so and so or Mary from so and so, because if you don't do that, you don't know which Mary it is.
No.
Sorry,
and then I just sort of moving on, that the very first sort of indication that there's something wider afoot here is actually the mention of Joseph of the house of David, and that's like a kind of theological trigger, isn't it, to us to say, whoa, wait a minute, whoa, what is in mind here? And it takes you straight back to the promise to David, that there'd always be one of his descendants on the throne of Israel. But you're kind of straight back there, and that's the first indication, really, in this particular passage, of something wider at work, I think.
It is. Also worth noting that the double mention of her being a virgin, again, it's interesting that on the one hand, Luke doesn't make anything of it. On the other hand, again, reading this with the Old Testament in background, you can't help but think about Isaiah chapter 7 and the promise that, a virgin will conceive and will bear a son.
Yeah.
Just in the next verse, verse 28, we get the greeting, and with my Roman Catholic background, where I had to learn the Hail Mary by heart.
My grace, the Lord is with thee.
Yeah, and of course, again, this is a really interesting example, isn't it, of the tradition obscuring the real sense of the text, because again, that you get lots of parallels in the Old Testament. So this pattern of a greeting and address and a reference to divine action that's found. I just mentioned a whole load of verses in Zephaniah 3 and Zechariah 9. In Joel 2, we get these kind of formulas. And actually what it should say is not so much hail, but greetings or rejoice to you.
Rejoice. Yeah, the Lord is with you. Yeah.
The Lord is with you. And again, the emphasis here, but also it comes in verse 30. And I was very struck by this, again, reading the passage. It's not that greetings, you who are full of grace already, and therefore God is acting. But you who have been filled by God with grace because he is bestowing his favor on you.
Yes.
And I suppose for me, that's the corrective to the other thing we do with this story. So on the one hand, we sometimes say, "Oh, Mary's a poor, miserable peasant, and isn't that nice that God's sort of done it?" On the other hand, with the other bit of piety, to say Mary is an amazing holy figure, so no wonder God sent an angel to appear to her. Where actually the emphasis is the other way around: is that yes,
Absolutely.
she's an ordinary person, but God has surprisingly bestowed His grace on her.
Yes, and I mean, God, the angel does not say, "The Lord be with you,"
Mm.
as if something needs to happen, but the Lord is with you because the Lord has shown His grace to you.
Yeah,
So this is the act. Well, I mean, what Luke is absolutely convinced by is that this is the action of God.
yeah.
It's a sovereign act of the Lord, isn't it?
Mm.
That is there.
Mm.
And it's interesting that I think the only exact parallel with an angel saying to somebody, "The Lord be with you" in the Old Testament is Gideon
It
in chapter
is. You're right.
6, which is very
Yeah.
interesting, where he says, "The Lord be with you, you mighty warrior," doesn't he? And that is prescient, of course, of what
Yeah.
exactly Gideon
Yeah.
must do. And here, so when an angel comes to you and says, "The Lord be with you," you need to brace yourself, because
Mm.
actually God
Mm.
is going to use you powerfully.
Mm.
So that's interesting. I think also the other thing is this: the response is this perplexed or fear. I think there's an element of fear here in the perplexing.
Mm.
That when the usual response of an angel to that in human beings is to say, "Do not be afraid."
Mm.
It's not a bad thing that the Lord is going to act through you for the salvation of the world. It's a good thing,
Yes.
but it's not always. I mean, I think I would still balk at because it can be terrifying when the Lord uses you and you suddenly realize He's using you,
Yeah.
can't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and I think it's just worth dwelling for a minute on some of the words here that Gabriel speaks. Gabriel, of course, Gibor, Ella's Gibor, Ella's mighty,
Yeah.
is the meaning of his name. And here's another interesting thing: that the only time we hear about Gabriel in the Old Testament is in Daniel.
Daniel, yeah, yeah.
And Daniel, and they're the tradition. Well, the Jewish tradition is that Gabriel is one of the 7 archangels.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Gabriel is associated with Michael, who appears in Revelation 12, obviously, as one of the 2 guardians of the nation. So,
Yeah.
so that again, you've already got these connotations of this is about the salvation of or the protection and deliverance of God's people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I was just in the Greek text that I'm looking at. Gabriel's words are actually laid out poetically, whereas in most
Yeah.
English translations they're not, and it's only Mary's response which is laid out poetically.
Mm.
So obviously we need to pay attention to this. And I was struck by, and I don't know how we engage with this. I was struck by just the extraordinary language that Gabriel uses here about the one who is to be born to Mary. So he will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High, which again echoes the sort of language that
Yeah.
that Zechariah is using in his prayer. And as you said, the Lord will give to him the throne of his father David. Well, there you've got the David illusion
Yeah.
back,
Again.
which we had
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
And what I was really struck by is that in English it sounds good, but it doesn't sound quite so terrifying. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever. Well, in Greek, of course, the reigning, whereas we miss out the difference between reigning and being a king or a queen. They come from different roots. But in Greek, you basiluo, and you are a
Yeah.
basileus, and you reign
Yes.
over Basileia. So
Yes.
the language of reigning over the kingdom
Yes.
and being a king is
Yes.
all cognate. It's all reinforcing. So
Yes. It's like you, the king, are kinging over the kingdom, isn't it? If you try to put it in English.
it is exactly that.
Mm.
And
Mm.
firstly, that strikes me as just sort of extraordinary. Here we are in kind of backwards Nazareth, and
Yeah.
yes, pious Mary and expectant Mary, but
Sure.
expectant of God to come and deliver his kingdom, not expecting that it'll be through her.
No. No.
And this is the one who's going to inherit this kingdom. And the other thing I couldn't miss seeing is, again, just reading the text here, is that the kingdom which will have no end. Well, where have we heard that phrase before?
Yeah.
Answer, Zechariah 7, when the
Yeah.
one like a son of man is ascended to the throne, and he is given the kingdom will never end.
Yeah. 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 Daniel 7. Yeah. Yeah.
Did I say Daniel
You
7?
said Zechariah, I think, but you meant
Sorry,
Daniel.
Daniel 7.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I just don't know how we capture what an
No.
extraordinary thing this is for Mary to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't. Part of the problem is we don't think in those terms, do we? Whereas I suspect people of the first century are probably more open to that idea. We wouldn't think in those terms in our own culture.
No.
We wouldn't use such extreme language, because in a sense it is extreme language, isn't it? It's all-encompassing language anyway, and yeah, difficult to communicate. And it's no wonder that Mary was terrified when, you know, she kind of learns what she was terrified to before she heard it, and she jolly well be terrified afterwards. But of course, that interestingly is not the response that she then gives. She, you know, she hears what the Holy Spirit will do, overshadowing, as we mentioned. But then this extraordinary response from her is quite different.
I'm frustrated that we have this tradition from the King James version of her saying, "I'm the handmaid of the Lord," which sounds as though she's there to sort of sweep the kitchen or do the washing up. Well, of course, she's just using the feminine of the word doulos. I'm the servant, I'm the slave
of the Lord.
Just as Paul in all his letters says, doulos of Jesus Christ.
She absolutely. And
let it be according to your word, which again also anticipates the nunc dimittis, doesn't it? So parallels there too.
And it's interesting, just in the middle of that, there's this reassurance from Gabriel that God is at work in her relative Elizabeth. You know, that this is not just you. There's something really important about that. And I think, especially as you think about this as a perspective from women, the support of one woman for another in pregnancy is vital, isn't it? So extraordinary. It's a very special bond that women form in that context. And I think there's something about God's provision for these two women, who are both being profoundly involved in the salvation of the world. Something rather special about that.
That reminds me, isn't some clip from a film? Is it Men in Black where he says, "We've come to save the world"? Oh, I can't go. when we use that language, it's always spoof, isn't it? So
yes. Well, they just get on with it.
I think that's a really interesting observation about the solidarity there, because then it goes on to explain the following narrative when they do in fact meet, and then the language there really makes sense, doesn't it?
And it's young and also it's young and old, interestingly. So often, and that's often the case in when women are pregnant, an older woman will support a younger one because they've been through it themselves. They've got that experience. We see that in our own church context all the time. So.
And this whole thing just leads to the perennial question every Christmas, isn't it? Which is, how do we ourselves and how do we help other people engage afresh with this story, which is otherwise so overladen with sort of sentimentality and sugar-coated, and because of that actually peels away from the reality and the earthiness and the drama of the actual biblical text.
I think you've got to delve into the details, haven't you? But of course, you are particularly challenged in this text because something really utterly supernatural and remarkable is happening in the middle of the earthiness. But there's something important about communicating how God does get involved in the earthiness of the world when we preach on it.
I think the other sort of passion I'd always have about preaching as well is that please, let's not turn this into a sort of story about things we ought to be doing and how we must try harder and hardering of the auguries and all that kind of thing, which it's a phrase I'll continue to deploy, because the whole focus of this story is God has done something, God is doing something, God will do something. So if you're going to be ready for anything, be ready for what God is going to be doing. Welcome what God is doing. He's doing something extraordinary and dramatic and unexpected and surprising and wonderful and grace-filled, and it's all about what God is doing, not about what you ought to be doing. And Christmas time.
No, absolutely.
Let's just finish with a couple of quotations from both Joel Green, weighty commentary, and also from our reliable friend Michael Parsons as well. Bright commentary, but packs a lot of detail in. Just from Joel Green, that he says, wonderful summary of what's going on here. The characters at the center stage in this section from Luke 1:5 to Luke 2:52 are for the most part exemplars of piety of Israel in Second Temple Judaism. As the character references given to Zechariah and Elizabeth, and especially the presentation of Jesus in the temple underscore, Luke is concerned to show the importance of faithful obedience. This obedience is to the law and is also extended to the words of the angel who speaks on God's behalf. In this world, we are breathing the air of first century Jewish piety. And Parsons goes on and makes this, I think, really helpful comment. This story has little room for sentimental musings about the first Christmas. Rather, it demands that its hearers then and now discern at their own commission and, despite whatever obvious shortcomings, commit themselves to the completion of what God is doing here.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
So powerful stuff. Friends, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to do those 4 lovely things: to like and to subscribe and to comment and to share on the social media. James, very good to see you. And we ought to say Happy Christmas to everybody, shouldn't we? Because
we should really, yeah, because I think we're having this sort of week off after, aren't we? So
I think we are. And do, folks, look at the blog for all sorts of, if you're short of ideas for preaching at Christmas, there's all sorts of resources there, including dramas. And we look forward to seeing you again next year.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. See you then.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.